China's foreign ministry renewed its criticism of Vietnam's land reclamation efforts on Bark Canada Reef in the Spratly Islands. It had previously complained about this particular reef in 2019.
Vietnam is rapidly expanding its presence in the South China Sea.
Artificial islands under construction could become military bases.
China thought it had already won the South China Sea. 7 artificial islands, 3 massive runways, missile batteries, radar arrays, fighter jets, a Coast Guard fleet bigger than most navies, a maritime militia that rams, swarms, and water cannons every foreign vessel that dares enter waters Beijing considers its own. China spent a decade and tens of billions of dollars building what analysts call the most sophisticated island fortress network ever constructed, and then declared the South China Sea a Chinese lake. Done. Settled. Irreversible. Except nobody told Vietnam. The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative confirmed that since early 2025, Vietnam has expanded land reclamation across all 21 of its occupied features in the Spratly Islands, building 8 new harbors, completing an 8,000-foot runway on Bark Canada Reef capable of landing most military aircraft, constructing munitions storage depots surrounded by thick protective walls at every single reef, and installing what analysts assess as anti-ship artillery and missile firing positions facing outward toward the water at each site. Every single reef, all 21, simultaneously. And Vietnam's total reclaimed land in the Spratlys now stands at over 3,300 acres, nearly 3/4 of China's total, with analysts saying Hanoi is on track to surpass Beijing's island-building scale entirely. Surpass. The country China thought it had already defeated in the South China Sea is building faster than China. And what Vietnam is building on those islands, the weapons, the runways, the doctrine behind all of it, is the reason China's Navy now faces a problem it never expected from a country it never took seriously. Before we reveal exactly what the 8,000-foot runway on Bark Canada Reef means for Su-30MK, 2 fighter bombers that can now reach every Chinese base in the Spratlys from Vietnamese soil, why munitions depots with thick protective walls facing outward at all 21 Vietnamese reefs are specifically designed to house anti-ship missile and artillery platforms that make Chinese naval passage through Vietnamese waters suicidal, how Vietnam built 8 new harbors enabling year-round Navy patrols that match China's presence in the Spratlys for the first time ever, why foreign security experts say Vietnam has already made it potentially costly for China's Navy to operate within 200 to 300 nautical miles of its coast, a capability it did not have a decade ago, what the BrahMos supersonic anti-ship missile deal with India means for China's surface fleet if those weapons reach the Spratlys, and why the new runway on Bark Canada gives Vietnam a position on the other side of China's Big 3 islands that breaks the strategic encirclement Beijing spent a decade constructing. Subscribe and hit that bell. Because what Vietnam just built in the South China Sea is not a provocation, it is a kill network, assembled reef by reef, runway by runway, missile depot by missile depot, that makes China's most expensive naval investment in history suddenly look very, very vulnerable. We connect it right now. Here is what Vietnam built on Bark Canada Reef, and why one 8,000-foot runway changes the entire strategic equation. Vietnam built an 8,000-foot runway on Bark Canada Reef, its largest feature in the Spratly Islands, with the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative confirming the airstrip significantly expands Vietnam's options for deploying combat aircraft to the Spratlys, and that Bark Canada now stretches over 4.5 kilometers in length, with a total reclaimed land area of approximately 2.8 square kilometers, 8,000 feet. That is enough for Su-30MK-2 fighter bombers, enough for maritime patrol aircraft, enough for any military aircraft in Vietnam's arsenal except the very heaviest strategic bombers. And Vietnam operates an expanding fleet of 30 Russian-supplied Su-30MK-2 multi-role aircraft, jets that have the range to strike targets throughout the South China Sea, as well as on the Chinese mainland. From a runway Vietnam just built in the Spratly Islands, Beijing protested immediately. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun stated, "The Nansha Islands are China's inherent territory. China has always opposed relevant countries carrying out construction activities on illegally occupied islands and reefs. China called it illegal. Vietnam kept building." Think about what the runway's position means strategically. Tom Sugart, adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, stated that another base and runway would give Vietnam a position on the other side of China's Big 3 islands, referring to Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief Reefs. The other side. China built Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief Reefs to dominate the central and southern Spratlys. Vietnam's Bark Canada Reef sits in the southern Spratlys, beyond those 3 Chinese bases from the perspective of Vietnamese territory. That means Vietnamese aircraft launching from Bark Canada can approach Chinese bases from a direction those bases were never designed to defend against. China built its island fortresses facing north and east, toward Taiwan and toward American carrier routes. Vietnam just opened a runway behind them. Gregory Poling, director of AMTI, confirmed that the new airstrip will considerably expand Vietnam's maritime patrol capabilities, noting that the existing runway on Spratly Island is too short for larger aircraft, and that Bark Canada has been specifically prepared for exactly this upgrade. Prepared for this. Not improvised, not opportunistic, planned. Vietnam planned this runway as part of a deliberate strategic architecture, and executed it while China's attention was fixed on Taiwan, on the Philippines, and on the American carrier presence it is trying to push out of the Pacific. Here is what went up at all 21 reefs, and why the munitions depots facing the ocean tell you everything about Vietnam's intentions. Satellite imagery confirmed munitions storage, in the form of 6 containers surrounded and separated by thick protective walls, has been constructed at each newly expanded Vietnamese reef, with Bark Canada Reef having the distinction of 3 separate munitions depots, while most other reefs have at least 1. Every reef, munitions storage, with thick walls separating individual containers, blast protection designed to ensure that a single hit on one container does not detonate all the others. That is not civilian construction planning. That is military hardening. At each reef, these collections of buildings and storage structures are positioned facing outward toward the water. And AMTI assessed that new formations of berms encasing 6 protected areas visible at Bark Canada Reef, Central Reef, Tennant Reef, Nam Yat Island, South Reef, and Lad Reef could be intended to house anti-ship artillery or missile platforms, facing outward toward the water. Anti-ship artillery facing the sea, missile platforms facing the sea, at all 21 Vietnamese reefs simultaneously. Think about what a Chinese naval commander sees when he plots a course through the Spratly Islands now. Every reef Vietnam controls has munitions depots. Every reef has structures that could house anti-ship missiles pointing outward. Every reef has, or will have, weapons capable of threatening his ships. The Spratlys are no longer a Chinese lake. They are a killing ground with weapons on both sides. Vietnam also planned 34 projects to strengthen infrastructure and armaments on its occupied features, including bunkers, command posts, firepower positions, weapon storage facilities, trench systems, and tactical facilities, plus a 180-meter-long port at San Khe. 34 projects, bunkers, command posts, firepower positions, trench systems. This is not island beautification. This is the construction of a distributed fortress network across the entire southern Spratlys, one that cannot be neutralized by striking a single point, because there is no single point. There are 21. Now here is what Vietnam built at sea level, and why 8 new harbors make China's year-round patrol advantage disappear. Vietnam built 8 new harbors across its newly expanded Spratly features, with AMTI assessing that these harbors will extend the time its naval and law enforcement forces can remain at sea, enabling Vietnam's Navy to match China's year-round patrols in the Spratlys for the first time. Match. For the first time. China's strategic advantage in the South China Sea has always been endurance. The ability to keep ships on station longer because China's artificial islands provide fuel, supplies, maintenance, and shelter. Vietnam's ships had to return to the Vietnamese coast to resupply, limiting how long they could maintain a presence. 8 new harbors eliminate that disadvantage entirely. Vietnamese naval vessels can now resupply in the Spratlys, stay on station for weeks, patrol continuously, match China ship for ship in the waters Vietnam claims. Bill Hayton, Associate Fellow of the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House, stated, "The overall program is dramatic. It shows that Vietnam is spending large amounts of money on defending its positions in the Spratlys. The addition of a new runway at Bark Canada Reef greatly enhances Vietnam's capabilities. It also looks as if the other features will acquire extra docks, helicopter pads, and weapons storage facilities. In time, we may see signals intelligence facilities added to the bases as China has done on its artificial islands. Signals intelligence facilities. In time. Vietnam is not just building what it has now. It is building the foundation for what comes next. The electronic warfare systems, the surveillance networks, the command and control infrastructure that China spent a decade installing on its own islands and thought only it could afford. Here is Vietnam's coastal missile network, and why China's Navy cannot safely approach within 300 miles of the Vietnamese coast. Foreign security experts assess that Vietnam has made it potentially costly for China's Navy to operate within 200 to 300 nautical miles of its coast, an ability it did not have a decade ago, through shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles that seek to guarantee that Chinese naval and air force operations within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone would encounter lethal and heavy resistance in the event of an attack. 200 to 300 nautical miles. That covers the entire western half of the South China Sea. Every approach route from China's Hainan Island naval base, every patrol route from China's Spratly Island fortresses, all of it within range of Vietnamese shore-based missiles that make Chinese naval operations lethally expensive. Vietnam's doctrine, articulated by the Institute for Military Strategy, now emphasizes that the Vietnam People's Navy should combat the enemy from afar, on the sea and on the islands, to counter hostile amphibious operations, centering on counter-amphibious operations both in land and marine environments, and the ability to contest and control disputed threats, even before an adversary can establish tactics on the ground. Combat the enemy from afar, before they can establish tactics. That is not a defensive doctrine. That is a preemptive maritime strike doctrine. The ability to hit Chinese amphibious forces while they are still at sea, before a single Chinese soldier reaches a beach. Vietnam built this capability specifically for one scenario, a Chinese attempt to seize its Spratly outpost by force. And Vietnam has the BrahMos dimension that China fears above all others. Vietnam has been in discussions to acquire the Indian-Russian-produced BrahMos missile, a supersonic anti-ship weapon described as the world's fastest cruise missile, which would further boost Vietnam's ability to threaten Chinese naval vessels at extended range. Supersonic, the world's fastest cruise missile, against a Chinese surface fleet that relies on the assumption that slower Vietnamese weapons give enough reaction time for interception. The BrahMos eliminates that assumption. A supersonic anti-ship missile fired from a Vietnamese reef in the Spratlys reaches a Chinese warship faster than the ship's close-in defense systems can reliably engage. Put BrahMos missiles in the munitions depots Vietnam just built on all 21 reefs, and every Chinese warship in the Spratlys is suddenly operating under a threat it cannot guarantee to neutralize. Here is why Vietnam's build triggers a regional arms race, and why China opened a Pandora's box it cannot close. A March 2026 Chatham House article confirmed that Vietnam's rapid expansion across all 21 Spratly features is framing its construction explicitly as a response to China's own island building, and that analysts warned this has effectively opened a Pandora's box of competitive island building across the entire region as claimants scramble to fortify their own outposts. Pandora's box. Every reef Vietnam fortifies signals every other South China Sea claimant that the window to build is now, before China consolidates dominance permanently. Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, all watching, all calculating. China spent a decade building its island fortresses while the region watched. The region is no longer watching. The Vietnam People's Army now prioritizes what it terms active defense, identifying threats early and preventing changes to the status quo, reflecting a deliberate doctrinal shift that has been building since Vietnam's 2019 Defense White Paper. Active defense, not passive resistance, not diplomatic protest. Active military positioning designed to impose costs on China before China acts. Vietnam learned from 1979, the last time China invaded and was repelled, and from 1988, when Chinese forces killed 64 Vietnamese sailors at Johnson South Reef. Vietnam does not intend to be caught unprepared again. Lansdowne Reef, where Vietnam has been aggressively expanding with new helipads and military facilities, lies directly adjacent to Johnson South Reef, where those 64 sailors died in 1988. Adjacent. Vietnam is fortifying the exact reef next to where China killed its soldiers 37 years ago. That is not construction. That is a statement. One thing is absolutely certain. Vietnam has expanded land reclamation across all 21 occupied Spratly features, with total reclaimed land exceeding 3,300 acres, nearly 3/4 of China's total, and on track to surpass it. An 8,000-foot runway on Barky Canada Reef now enables Vietnam to deploy Su-30 Mk2 fighter bombers capable of striking targets across the South China Sea and reaching the Chinese mainland. Munitions storage depots surrounded by thick protective blast walls have been constructed at every single newly expanded reef. Structures assessed as anti-ship artillery and missile platforms face outward toward the water at all 21 Vietnamese positions. 8 new harbors enable year-round Vietnamese naval patrols, matching China's presence in the Spratlys for the first time. Foreign security experts confirm Vietnam has already made Chinese naval operations within 200 to 300 nautical miles of its coast potentially suicidal. Vietnam is in discussions to acquire the BrahMos supersonic anti-ship missile, the world's fastest cruise missile. Chatham House analysts called the overall program dramatic and warned it has opened a Pandora's box of competitive island building across the entire region. And China's own foreign ministry protested the construction, which Vietnam ignored and accelerated. So here's what happens next. China spent a decade building the South China Sea into a Chinese lake. It militarized 3 massive artificial islands. It deployed fighters, bombers, and anti-ship missiles. It ran its Coast Guard and maritime militia as instruments of daily coercion. And it assumed that no Southeast Asian nation had the money, the will, or the dredging technology to build back. Vietnam proved all 3 assumptions wrong simultaneously. It bought Dutch dredgers. It planned 34 military construction projects. It built runways, harbors, munitions depots, and missile platforms across all 21 of its reefs, while China's attention was fixed on Taiwan and the American carrier fleet. The South China Sea is no longer a Chinese lake. It is a contested killing ground with Vietnamese weapons on one side of China's big 3 islands and Chinese weapons on the other. Vietnam is still building. Stay tuned.